The following program is a UWTV classic.
The transformation from mass culture to popular culture, next on Upon Reflection.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Ross Reynolds. You may think of propaganda in terms of posters from the Stalin era extolling the Soviet state, but our guest today sees propaganda going through changes prompted by popular culture. He's Alex Edelstein, Professor Emeritus at the University of Washington's School of Communications, and he's the author of Total Propaganda: From Mass Culture to Popular Culture. Alex Edelstein, thanks very much for being with us on Upon Reflection.
Thank you, Ross.
Let's start with that definition of propaganda, which is a kind of a set definition in many of our minds, but as I read this book, I realized that you're talking about propaganda in much more expansive terms. What do you mean by it?
Well, I'm taking the view essentially of Jacques Ellul, the French theorist, who said that the greatest change in propaganda in the 20th century was the transition from a propaganda in a mass culture of propaganda being directed by leaders to the led, by leaders to the masses, to a propaganda in which everyone took part, in which the elites created the propaganda and used it for fuel. So this is an enormous transition from people just being the objects of propaganda to people generating propaganda. And as a matter of fact, you were asking me earlier, how was I following up on this book? And yes, I was. And the sort of the working title was "Teach a Dog to Dance."
And why that title?
And then the subtitle was propagandizing ourselves into the 21st century. So that was the notion. And these various committees that you see around town and around the state on Stadia and other issues, these are examples of people who have learned to use propaganda and who are really creating the agenda for the public.
Now, old propaganda, as you define it, is what many of us probably think of when we think of propaganda.
Right.
You define it as being usually from a totalitarian state. A top-down process of information,
few to many,
and indoctrination of the masses.
Censorship, control, coercion. Matter of fact, one of the great problems in the study of 20th century propaganda was distinguishing between the effects of propaganda itself, as it were, as an entity, and the coercive environment in which the propaganda took place. So how much of it was coercion and how much of it was, say, the printed or the spoken message. The propaganda of the deed, which we know quite a bit about today, is very persuasive, as again you were mentioning in Stalinist or Leninist propaganda. So you do something, and that's the message.
But didn't democracies also promulgate the old propaganda, particularly during war efforts?
Yeah, in a sense, and this led to excesses, of course. And during World War I, for an example, we had a head of propaganda here, a progressive by the name of George Creel, who was one of the people who was very close to President Wilson. And he had extraordinary power. He was director of censorship, director of overseas propaganda, director of domestic propaganda. He sat on a committee that included the Department of Defense, or then the Department of War, the War Department as they called it, and so on, and the Treasury and so forth. And he was extraordinarily powerful. Comparing him to Joseph Goebbels, who was supposed to be the most significant 20th century propagandist, Goebbels really takes a back seat, because Goebbels never really did get complete control of both foreign and domestic propaganda. Many agencies in the Nazi government had propaganda machines, not under Goebbels' control. And as a matter of fact, it was so bad that Goebbels, when he wrote his diaries, had to go back and change the diaries to make certain that things came out better than they actually did, because he had lost control of the process.
What were some of the successes of propaganda in this country, of the total propaganda, the old propaganda style? What did it accomplish in changing people's minds or formulating public opinion?
Right. Well, I try to distinguish between what I call the old propaganda, which means exclusivity, control, censorship, a few to many, and so on, that kind of thing, to the new propaganda, which is many to many, you see, and inclusiveness. And I even argue that while everyone predicted the re-election of President Clinton, not everyone predicted it for the right reason, or the same reason. And I predicted his re-election on the basis that he was committed to the new propaganda, or in the language that I constructed, new prop, whereas Dole found himself victimized by his own old prop, and then retreated to a kind of hard prop, and then softened it, soft prop, you see.
Let's sort out these props.
Well, that's part of my language.
Let's talk about, let's first of all define what you mean a little bit more by new prop.
New prop is inclusive. For example, if you talk about rap music, it is largely old prop because it dehumanizes and minimizes and is conflictual and all of these things. But there are elements of rap music, what I call rap prop, you see, that ask for inclusion, that protests the exclusion of this group of people, of this marginalized constituency, as it were, for membership in the popular culture. They're being excluded by being diminished, dehumanized, and so forth. And so anything that diminishes, dehumanizes, is conflictual rather than accommodational, so to speak, to make up a very bad word, and so forth. This affords a contrast that's really quite readily seen. And you can see, as a matter of fact, people using old prop, that is, diminishing people for what they consider to be new prop purposes. That is, you can get after the people who prevent diversity from taking hold, you see, and you may minimize them. At the same time, your purpose, you see, is to maximize the inclusion of a group that's been excluded. So you see new prop and old prop in different relationships to one another as ends and means.
Do people who practice what you call new propaganda even think of themselves as being propagandists, or are they just promulgating a lifestyle or an opinion that they have? Are they consciously trying to convert people or convince people of that?
Like no and yes. They know, you know, that they're in the marketplace of ideas, and that they are advancing their cause, and that they are being selective, and they're being deliberate, and that they are organized, and that they have targets, spin doctors, PR people, lobbyists, and so on. They're all engaged in what I call propaganda. Everything is propaganda to me. The distinctions are between the old propaganda and the new propaganda.
So you see propaganda as being value-free, neutral, because we associate propaganda with evil and lies.
Right, and that's the great problem. Putting to rest the old paradigm and allowing ourselves to think in terms of the new paradigm, to remove the disopprobrious, you see, connotations of propaganda as being bad, you see, and talk about old propaganda, new propaganda, not talk about bad propaganda and good propaganda, because that's in the eye and the mind of the beholder.
You utilize a word form that you've come up with for this book, the unonym.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I invented a word.
We've already used the unonym several times.
We have. I realized that I needed a word for it because I've taught in Germany and so forth, and one cannot help but observe how the Germans have made words longer and longer, you see. And then you come back to American culture, and we've made words and communication, smaller and smaller, and swifter and swifter, and so forth. And this was something that George Orwell did when he talked about newspeak. You see, he sort of combined a couple of terms. And I thought, well, what we've been doing has been going on for a long, long time, but we don't have a word for it. So the word I invented for it was the unonym. So old prop is a unonym. And more interesting, perhaps, infoprop is a unonym, because I argue that we can't distinguish between information and propaganda.
Let's talk about that a little bit more, because your idea of the unonym is that the two halves of this new word are influencing one another in a subtle way. So, for example, when you say infoprop, information propaganda, how does that fuse and create a new understanding, a new word?
Well, we know that there's propaganda in information. We know there's information in propaganda. The media has had a terrible time trying to sell the term objectivity to everyone. The media now recognizes that objectivity is more of a methodology. That is, it's a way of getting after the story rather than an outcome. So if you have multiple sources, that's part of a methodology of objectivism. Or if you have two sides, that makes it, quote, more objective. But it doesn't make it more true. It doesn't make it more valid. And so they're stuck with a term that they can't defend. And we are stuck with the term propaganda that we can't really defend because there's a lot of information in propaganda. And we're stuck with the term information that we can't defend because there's a lot of propaganda and information.
Yet propaganda, the classic definition of propaganda means promulgating a doctrine or a cause.
Right.
And when we think of the news, then, what's the doctrine or cause that news prop, for example, is trying to promulgate? Its own objectivity, its own fairness?
Well, it has its own ideology. If it's new, it's news. So there you are. If it's immediate, it's news. If it's objective, it's news. Otherwise, it's something else. It's commentary. Well, what is commentary but opinion? What is opinion but laden with propaganda? Deliberately constructed messages designed to persuade, institutionalized, much like propaganda. But the heritage of the word is really very difficult to deal with. And all I really hope to achieve this time around was some sort of discussion. And I really have I just saw a review in which the person was furious with me for using the word propaganda in this way. And she said, propaganda is this. So I just dropped her note and I said, there are as many different definitions of propaganda as there are definitionists. And I said, I could have said, as there are leaves on the trees.
You mentioned that the genesis of this book, Total Propaganda, actually came from a class you were teaching in which you were talking about the old propaganda, what we traditionally think of as propaganda, and the students just didn't get it.
Well, they sat back there, and I could read the message. Well, Professor, you're being very entertaining and informative in a sense, but we're not really interested, nearly as interested as you are, and we doubt, no matter what your wiles, so to speak, as a professor, that you can make us as interested in this subject matter as you want us to be. And those were the kind of looks that I got, sort of querulous in a sense. And so finally I looked at them and I said, okay, I said, this is not really going. I said, you get it, I get it, but we're not going anywhere with it. So what kind of propaganda do you want to study? And some kid in the back of the room raises his hand and says, Duran Duran. And I looked at him, nonplussed. And finally I remembered, and I said, oh, a rock star. And he says, awesome, Prof. So then they all came up with Kurt Cobain and Rush Limbaugh.
And you quote Kurt Cobain, you quote Ice-T in this book.
Oh, sure,
But say, for example, Kurt Cobain. What's the doctrine or cause that Kurt Cobain's trying to espouse in his propaganda?
Well, that was actually
in
curious.
Prop.
In Nirvana Prop, right. That was rather curious, actually, because Cobain kept telling his admirers, his cult, as it were, that he wasn't interested in being their leader. He was very plain about it. He said, you have adopted me as your leader, and I refuse to accept that. I'm an artist, and I say what I think, and I write what I know, and sing what I wish. And if you get it, okay, or how you get it, okay, but kind of like, don't blame me, you see. And by contrast, Eddie Vedder and Pearl Jam, he deliberately attempted to enlist his followers, his fans, in his message. He was part Indian or Native American, and he espoused their themes and so forth, and he carried on crusades against like Ticketmaster and so forth. So here was an avowed propagandist, and the other, Cobain, was an avowed artist. And yet they both acquired constituencies who believed that they were their leaders and attempted to make them play that role.
I think vital to understanding what you're writing about here and the change from old propaganda to new propaganda is actually the subtitle of your book, How We've Changed from a Mass Culture to a Popular Culture.
Right.
What do you mean? What's that transition been?
Well, again, in a mass culture, people didn't have the levels of education that we have now. They didn't have the avenues to communicate as they do now. There was no internet. Matter of fact, another critic said, my goodness, the internet is just trendy. It's not propaganda, you see. It's too trendy. You know, how trendy is a trend, and how long does something have to be a trend before it's a watershed or whatever, as we call these things. So I just began to ask myself the question in relation to this, how are we changing from this society in which we were led by leaders to where we are controlling our own environment and have to be alert not only to the messages of others, but become prepared to transmit messages on our own. Are we in transition from a mass culture to a popular culture? If so, at what rate? How can we determine this? And I said, well, I think we can determine this by studying the propaganda.
And apparently technology has had a great deal to do with the creation of the popular culture. You just mentioned the internet. There are many more means to disseminate a message than there were 20 or 30 years ago.
Sure.
Not just the internet, but cable television and publications become a lot easier.
Yes, and the mega store, for an example, the mega mall. Take REI. Here you have people climbing stone pillars, you see. They're a participant. And I point out that total propaganda is not simply an additive thing. It's not simply the sum of all propagandas extant at a particular moment in time. Total propaganda is a product of the synergies that exist between various forms and media and messages, and the energies that these synergies produce, so that the sum of the total propaganda propaganda is greater than the sum of its parts. It's a product of new energies. MTV is a wonderful example of this. Sight, sound, movement, and so forth, color, you see.
To what degree, though, are there really a multiplicity of opinions and viewpoints and perspectives when the means of communication, although they're varied and multiple, we see that the ownership of news organizations is actually shrinking. There are fewer and fewer companies that have control of many news organizations. Now, they may deliver the news in a different fashion from MTV to a staid newspaper, and yet the control over the means of communication seems to be constricting. That seems like an old propaganda style, that fewer people are in control.
Well, when I was in graduate school, some time ago, the professor used to ask, is bigness badness? And so studies were launched in various parts of the country, and they discovered that the media were rivals not in competition but in conformity. That is to say, if there are 5 newspapers in this town instead of the 2 that we have
in Seattle,
they would be very similar. They would be far more similar than they are different. And the reasons are that there are time constraints, there are technological constraints, there are constraints of talent. For an example, kids would say, well, why are we in journalism? And I would say, well, I heard that, you can't count, so you can't be an accountant, that you're not, precise, so you can't be a lawyer, and you can't stand the sight of blood, so that you can't become a doctor, and you yell every time you see a dentist, and so on and so forth. So the only profession left for you is journalism, you see. So they would laugh, and they'd say, well, there's something more to it than that, they would say, and I'd say, I agree, you have commitments, and you're interesting and wonderful young people. But still, there are constraints on the newspaper. They can only afford, they think, to pay so much. I've always argued with that. I've always thought that there should be fewer reporters and more administrative assistance for them, so that the abilities of a good reporter can be multiplied in that fashion, just as an excellent secretary or administrative assistant can do a marvelous job for whoever the administrator is.
A lot of the characteristics of new propaganda that you describe sound very appealing: non-ideological, diversity, everybody gets a chance to say something. But one of them caught me up short, and that was, you talk about old propaganda being historical and new propaganda being contemporary. And that made me wonder whether the very drive to be contemporary and new propaganda may neglect lessons of the past.
I understand. That's the problem with creating figures or tables, as they call them, and having so-called attributes, which are opposites of one another. I really meant that contextually in time. And then also I was sort of offended by Newt Gingrich's sense of history, that his history could not really be replicated because it was so peculiar to him, you see. And when you can't follow someone's tracks, that's old prop, when you conceal your tracks, so to speak.
What was an example of something he said that was old
prop?
He
talked about the origins of American society and the values that we have always had, and then he cited certain sources. Well, there are other sources to the contrary, and he didn't pay attention to those. So some of the differences between old prop and new prop, parallel differences between so-called propaganda and information historically, but they're not intended to be said as good or bad, and they are not intended to rest solely on attributional grounds, but as a process, so that there can be old prop and new prop, and often is in the same message, but you look at the thrust of the message, and that determines sort of on balance whether it has the, shall we say, the functions of old prop or new prop.
Is there a future for old propaganda? We see the rise of new propaganda, but will old propaganda still be with us?
Well, I think in this debate that we've had between the president's supporters and his detractors, we've seen them both use old prop and hold forth the promise of new prop.
Give an example of how they used both.
Well, I think when they, should say, got on to Kenneth Starr, a lot of that was old prop. Yet at the same time, they talked about the rule of law again, that the grand jury proceedings are supposed to be secret, and it's just as much of a felony, you see, to divulge the proceedings of a grand jury as it is to suborn someone to perjury, that these are both felonies. So in one sense, they're accusing somebody of doing something maliciously and so forth and purposefully. In the other case, they're holding forth the promise of a society of laws, you see. And that is, and laws are intended to promote inclusiveness, although, as we often know, law doesn't always accomplish that. It's merely its purpose.
Does old propaganda work more effectively with certain groups of people in society, and does new propaganda work more effectively? And I'm not thinking of age, which we've talked about a little bit, but I'm thinking of socioeconomic status.
Well, it's a very good question. As a matter of fact, it does work by age. That is, young people and the oldest people, whom I call the ARPies, that is, those who belong to the American Association of Retired People, ARP, so they're ARPies. So the Generation X, curiously, the 20-somethings, they tend to be more into new prop. The boomers, that vast sort of group in between, tend to go both ways. Now we've seen the emergence of new classes. So the people don't identify so much with their generations as much as they once did, but identify with their classes. And this can be a new political class, it can be a new religious class, it can be a new economic class. So the affluent and the neo-whatevers that emerge as political groups, they have taken on their own colorations, which sometimes distinguish them from the generation. So everything's becoming more complicated.
What is lost with the move to new propaganda? I'm old enough to remember when there were 3 networks, and You pretty much watched the same television shows. You read the same news magazines. There was a sort of a lingua franca among people about what contemporary ideas were. And
Right.
in this explosion of media and new propaganda and such a multiplicity of voices, do we sacrifice anything in terms of a national identity?
No, I think we gain a new national identity, a new national identity of diversity. And we have different challenges. And I think that the characteristics of a good joke are still pretty much the same, and the characteristics of good theater are still the same, and good
yet,
people
some good
as well.
jokes in some circles now will be seen as very wrong in other circles. I mean,
Well, they
likewise
always were. That's why we had Victorians, so to speak.
as you gaze into the future, what do you see the future of new propaganda being? Do you see it picking up speed, getting yet more diverse, getting more powerful?
Ebb and flow, depending on events, if they're threats to the society. Remember when we did the first Gulf War, and maybe that was Freudian, the first Gulf War, President Bush described Saddam Hussein as another Hitler. That was a regression. Interestingly, it didn't sell. I mean, the idea that he was a person to say dislike and distrust, carried the day, so to speak. But there wasn't a hatred of Saddam Hussein. No one really believed he was another Hitler. They believed I think essentially that he was a misguided zealot.
Do we see, in times of crisis, a reversion to old propaganda, a desire
Yes.
to gain control of the means of communication and simplify the
Yes,
message?
that's why censorship is so bad. That's why they should not censor the internet in any way other than that they censor other forms of communication, only to protect us against a really greater danger, as with children and elements of that, considerations of that kind.
Can the people who used to rely on old propaganda just turn around and adopt the new means of propaganda to their ends?
I doubt it.
They won't be able to,
I think many are mired in old prop,
and that will relegate them to
and
the
they will always be subject to arousal. I point out in the book, in the section on politics, how Patrick Buchanan, you see, his constituency became narrowed by that.
Alex Edelstein, the book is called Total Propaganda from Mass Culture to Popular Culture. Thank you very much for being with us on Upon Reflection.
Thank you very much, Ross.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.